there's something extremely compelling about the idea of David Bird as an artist, because he produced the work over a period of 50 years. He worked relatively in isolation. He showed the work to very few people. And in a strange way, he becomes almost like the perfect sort of romanticized idea of the artist, an individual who is compelled to make the work for himself. The work's produced on its own terms. It isn't produced for galleries, for exhibitions, for the market. And in that sense, you know, I think David Bird, even though he clearly isn't, subscribes to sort of the classic image of the outsider artist. And I think for a lot of people, that's quite an appealing idea of the artist, i.e. someone who's unaffected by commerce, or unaffected by fame or celebrity or notoriety. That is the artist who simply makes the work, you know, for what people might call the right reasons. I think David Bird is a much more complicated individual and a much more complicated artist than that sort of cliched idea of the artist. But there are things about his life and the circumstances in which the work was made which are extremely unusual, and they're especially unusual in the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. That you know, he was a man who was exposed to the world. He was a man who was exposed to very difficult aspects of life, and he was a man who'd been exposed to high culture as a younger man at the end of the Second World War, and who'd studied art. So he doesn't really satisfy any of the conventional ideas that we might think of in relation to an outsider artist. Yet at the same time, his work has this sort of very singular poetry, this sort of idiosyncratic nature that seems to be untroubled by external influences. And again, I don't think this is true, but I think it's sort of almost this magic, almost sleight of hand that Bird manages to pull off in the work, where he just creates a completely convincing, self-contained world through his art. And you know, for that, I think it is unusual, and I think for that reason, there's something extraordinarily compelling about this work, even on first encounter. And certainly the response we've had so far at White Columns, just from visitors to the gallery, is pretty consistent, that everybody finds something in the work that speaks to them. And you know, this is one of the amazing qualities of David Bird's work, outside of and beyond what's depicted, how it's depicted, and so on. So I think as more people get to know David Bird's work, as the exhibition at Anton Kern opens later this month, as the work gets published, as the work gets seen wider, and hopefully, you know, that someone will eventually organize a full-scale retrospective of the work and publish a monograph that will fully investigate and interrogate his life. A much clearer picture, I think, will emerge of David Bird. But for the moment, at least, in this sort of nascent time for his work, it's interesting that we don't have all the answers, and not everything is resolved, and not everything is clear. The ambiguity that exists in the work is allowed to maintain its place too. The individuals depicted are often not recognizable, in the sense that they don't appear to be attempts at realism. I think he's much more interested in creating or conjuring up an image that speaks more universally, in a more complex way. And that's really more of a psychological portrait of an individual than a depiction of an individual. This is the way that the exhibition is installed at White Columns. This is the final painting, and it's different for a number of reasons. That, along with the painting of the hospital itself, which shows the architecture of the place that he worked, it's one of the few paintings that doesn't include a human subject or a recognizable human form. David made a maquette for a book that looked back and considered his time at the hospital between 58 and 88. And there's a drawing of this painting in the book with a short note which sort of describes the scene, which I would otherwise not have been privy to. And as far as I understand it, one of the patients in the hospital on the ward would move this table and block the entrance to the bathroom. And then it would be someone else's responsibility, a nurse, or in fact David's responsibility, to put it back where it came from. And this sort of repeated behavior, these repeated interactions between the patients, the orderly, the nurses, and the space itself, the architecture of the hospital, and this object, the table, strike me as a very kind of sort of beautiful and poetic moment in the daily routines that David would have experienced at the hospital. And the fact that he chose to make a painting of it, I think so speaks volumes to his, just his extraordinary powers of observation and empathy, and also his understanding of his situation and his circumstances. And again, to go back to that text where he very much talks about his interest in how the patients coped with the staff, which I thought was a really extraordinary way of thinking about it, because you wouldn't necessarily be thinking that the patients would be coping with the staff. You'd think that the staff are coping with the patients. And I thought it was an extraordinary reversal, because it really puts the emphasis there onto the patients, and the staff were there really to help and serve the patients and not the other way around. So somehow in this seemingly innocuous painting of a table in the doorway, it opens up, I think, into this extraordinary narrative about a time spent in a place with other people, and the kind of the life of the hospital somehow is embedded in these objects. It's also extraordinarily beautifully painted painting, and I think there's a lot of just the technical things that are very unique, I think, or at least idiosyncratic to David's work, are very evident in terms of the color and the mark making, the space he creates within the painting itself. It seems almost exemplematic of his work, albeit it's missing the central element of his work, which is the figure.
But there's something so unique in the topics, in the subject matter, in those sujets, that you can't understand. I mean, I still, looking at this, is this a friendly picture, let's say? What's going on? What's the relationship? And then, of course, we know about the tragic biography of David Byrd. And then it gets extremely complex. And the complexity then really grids itself, it kind of entangles itself, and of course then it all makes sense all of a sudden, but also it doesn't make sense. That this man, for all those years, has been obscure, undiscovered, not seen. And that still happens today is like, it makes me shiver, you know, because it's something that he sits there in his studio on the easel and paints with these tiny little brushes and does this thing. And he does it in a way that is undescribable, and it's really, there's no comparison to it.
And it's such a large, finished body of work, unique, immediately identified.
Yeah.
Did you say that?
No, it is a total finished, and it's well finished. He died 87 years old. This is really what the codex is. When I saw this, that I was told or shown by Jody and Jessica, it's like when you see an image that's over there, for instance, a painting that has this drawing, which is larger in real life, that someone goes through the trouble to do this is interesting, brilliant, and also it's mind-boggling, because the man was really consumed with what he has observed, and he wanted to somehow bring it to life. And these pictures, they will live forever. They will absolutely live until the end of time, because they're going to be there. They're going to survive all of us. So he succeeded, you know, in the end, that his work has been shown, and not just with me. I mean, I think this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning of what's there to come.
Anything you can say about how you see David fitting into any idea of art history? That,
I hope so.
yeah.
I think he will, and I'm going to do my part to do that, for sure. I want him to be, I mean, I want him to be at the biggest museums in the world, and in small museums and institutions everywhere. He should be shown. He should be seen. I think these paintings hold up next to the masters, for sure. No, I'm convinced.
Okay.